Hello and welcome to Ontological Shock.
Ontological shock.
I am Nathaniel Voss.
My name is Seth.
And we're back again for another conversation. Today we're going to be talking about magic and mysticism and esotericism.
More or less.
Yep.
Loosely.
Yeah, more or less loosely. Maybe with a little bit of an experiential bent.
Who knows?
Yeah, some of the format of this show as it's been developing is to just to explore conversation, ideas. You know what I mean?
We promise this is not scripted.
Yeah, definitely not. So you're a practicing mystic. You're a practicing occultist. You're an initiate. You've been delving into this thing for a long-ass time. How long would you say you've been involved in that general domain?
Well, it's actually, I just got an astrology reading recently, and she was reading my chart, and she's like, wow, you've been into this for a long time. And I'm like, right. And she's like, probably till you were around 15. And I think about it, and I'm like, oh, that might be correct. And then she goes, or earlier. And then I had to think about all this stuff, and I remember when I was a child and I would go to the library, I was always looking at the books on ghosts. Mm-hmm. Witches and UFOs, because they were terrifying.
That's the good stuff, right?
That's the good stuff. And then eventually, I had some more life happen. And then after that, I came back into this stuff, and I was like, I'm going to devote my life to this for some strange reason.
What inspired you to... Do you remember that moment?
I remember a moment when I was in a library at my school, and there was some book... which had on the cover Aleister Crowley, Gurdjieff, Madame Blavatsky, and a fourth person who I cannot remember who it was. And I've since looked for this book and cannot seem to find it. But it was probably a really poor depiction on what these people did and why they were related. But I remember reading it and was thinking, I should probably be living in a monastery somewhere just studying this.
Wow.
Yeah. But I never...
That's like some karma reincarnation shit.
Yeah, I guess it could be. Who knows? But I never found a monastery. But
when I say that, it's kind of loosely based in the Tibetan idea that if you hear about a teaching and you feel kind of magnetized by it and you get the sense that this is very important, it means that you have probably worked on it in the past. Or at least that's what that tradition says.
I think there's definitely ideas like that in the West, too. That sounds very familiar. Heart teacher.
Right, heart teacher. Right. Yeah, I've been into this stuff for a long time. And similarly, I remember coming across books about esotericism in the school library. And I remember encountering people who were also in... I guess middle school or high school, who were claiming to be a witch. And the idea coming to me oh, that's a real thing? Like that exists in the actual world as a living tradition? I specifically remember thinking, does that mean I could be like Darth Vader?
And that's the thing that really tipped you over the edge right there.
Yeah. That was one of the thoughts that arose, certainly. So... how did you get into practicing this stuff on a serious level?
I mean, I think I was just kind of delving around, reading whatever and trying whatever, And thank you very much. And I'm trying to remember that. I mean, I remember at one point I was living in Indonesia, and I was living in a house with nothing to do, and practicing stuff from Donald Michael Craig's book, Modern Magic.
Yeah, that was a turning point for me, the Donald Michael Craig book.
Yeah, it was crazy, but it's kind of ironic too, because I was living in a country filled with magic and mysticism of its own type, which is completely unrelated to late 1880s Victorian occultism, which is what I was getting really into at the moment. So odd, but I don't know. I honestly don't remember exactly when I started really getting into it. I know that particular time was a seminal moment.
Right.
It's funny, too, when you mention your history, because not 20 minutes ago you gave an anecdote about the other kids waiting for the bus, I think.
Right.
And you both
Right.
studying something, but something very different.
Yeah, we were at the gas station down the block from here, and I was pointing out, you see that apartment complex over there? When I was in the 9th grade, I was just getting started with, studying esotericism in general. I was also looking at shamanism and some other stuff, starting to get into comparative religion. And at that point, I think I was starting to work with, some of the thelemic stuff as well.
Sure.
And the reason I point that out as an anecdote is just to share the experience of being a weird kid. Is it on Rune Soup or A Cult of Personality where they often they start the interviews with, "Were you a weird kid?" It's like a convention.
Yes, I remember that. I don't remember which one that is, but I've heard that.
Right,
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So, the Donald Michael Craig book, that was one of the first serious spiritual disciplines that I undertook in like a kind of rigorous, organized manner.
Sure.
And maybe not. Maybe I did the... I don't think that's true. I think I might have done the Anton LaVey stuff first.
Nice. So practical.
Well, you know what it was? I feel like that stuff helped me to make a clean break from the Christian thing. And I feel like that gave a sense of really making a hard left turn. And I remember thinking to myself, if anything about the Christian cosmology is true, then I'm definitely going to hell. And having made that definite step had a kind of therapeutic value to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's initiatory in its own right.
Yeah, definitely.
Did you ever see that book, Generation Hex? I think Jason
Yeah,
Lube
I remember
edited
that
it.
one.
Yeah, cool thing about that, I haven't thought about that book in quite a long time, actually, but the cool thing about it is it's all these stories of kind of like weird self-initiatory situations that mostly pretty young people end up in, and they all are completely different. There's no unifying system throughout it. That's one of the cool things about chaos magic, I think, is like, because that, whatever it means, doesn't have really a system. Yeah. It's initiatory in itself to do the practice and see like, oh shit, the magic works, or oh, what does this mean, or what do I do now, or that's a huge turning point.
I didn't hear about chaos magic until I was a little bit older, and I was working as a telemarketer, and I was selling chimney cleanings.
Okay.
And there was toward the end of my tenure there, this other kid was like, we got started talking about some general metaphysical stuff, and I was still a little bit wet behind the ears trying to figure this stuff out. And he's like, "Yeah, did you ever hear about Liber Chaos?"
Wow.
No, yeah. And so
that's not even the real accessible one.
No, that's I remember there was a period of time I was living in this basement with my mom, and the only two books I was reading were like The Nature of Personal Reality by Jane Roberts.
Yes.
And Liber Chaos.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it was intense, and you're learning how to. I was simultaneously teaching myself all these world religions, and pretty much reading about how to take your own paradigm apart and put it back together.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's raw. The first time I ever rode a Greyhound bus, I was reading the Illuminatus trilogy.
Yeah.
And listening to something on my headphones, which generally I would imagine to be like a fairly clear signal. It's like, leave me the fuck alone, right? I'm completely closed off to the world. But some guy in another seat like started tapping me. Mm-hmm. And I looked up and, what do you want? And he goes, is that science fiction? And I said, I guess, sure. And he goes, I've only read 4 books in my entire life. And then I'm like, oh? And he goes, yeah, Dianetics, medical hypnosis, the Bible, and I don't remember what the 4th one was. Wow. But so immediately, I closed my book. I'm like, okay, tell me more about these 4 books. And it ended up being a really wonderful conversation. with this man who finally, at the next stopping point on the bus, got up out of his seat, put a serape on, picked up a djembe with no other luggage, and then went off somewhere.
You can definitely meet some interesting people on the bus.
Yeah.
You know, when I was doing the Donald Michael Cragg thing, that was when I first induced the state that Daniel Ingram calls the arising and passing away.
Wow, I'm happy to hear this story.
It was fun because I was also obsessed with science fiction and obsessed with Thelema and just watching the same like B science fiction movies and great science fiction movies on VHS again and again, and just doing these rituals and these concentration practices. And while I was doing it, I found that my visualization skills weren't what I wanted them to be. So I started making up my own exercises that deviated from the ones in the book. So, you know, as you're very aware, like when you do the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, you want to be able to visualize bright blue electric flame.
Sure.
I don't know if that's the way they traditionally did it, like with the regular day stuff and back in the real Golden Dawn, but that's
I believe it is.
Okay. So I feel like there's always a couple liberties with the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. Every time I read it, it's slightly different.
Sure.
But anyway, I was trying to just visualize the flame at the end of my finger for extended periods of times to see if I could really solidify it. Mm-hmm. And then I started getting into just watching whatever visions would spontaneously coalesce when my eyes were closed. And then I started to really appreciate, well, you know what? Sometimes this gets really, really vivid. I wonder what would happen if I just sat here and I watched this for hours. Because I didn't really have an idea of what meditation was, but I'd like kind of seen it in like kung fu movies or cartoons. So I was like, well, maybe that's what meditation is. So I just started in the midst of doing, you know, this Western ceremonial magic curriculum every day and working with the tarot and trying to internalize all those systems. I started like spending a couple hours every night just watching whatever images would materialize. And then what I found worked, just kind of blindly groping my way through it, was to focus on whatever the most vivid aspect of any vivid was, switch to that being the center of attention, and just go on like that.
Damn.
And eventually what happened was I was in the shower in the dark, and I had this out-of-body experience as I was doing all these mystical contemplations, because I was taking all of these verses and paragraphs and sentences that I found from these different New Age texts and, you know, cheesy spiritual texts or legitimate mystical religious texts, and sort of trying to stitch them together and memorize them. And I spent a lot of time doing that because, you know, my mom was crazy. We didn't have a car. So anytime I would walk from place to place in the suburbs, it would be hours and hours of walking. So I would just walk around memorizing this stuff.
Sure.
And that was a kind of concentration practice in and of itself.
Of course.
But anyway, I'm in the shower, and it's kind of like this sensory deprivation setup. And I had this out-of-body experience where I was like moving through all these scenes in, I remember The Matrix and probably Star Wars. But you went through all these moments and these things where Morpheus is like, don't think you are, know you are. And it became progressively more vivid and progressively more disembodied. And it ended with the scene of the quickening at the end of the director's cut of Highlander. This is why I started off by saying, you know, I was watching all these VHS like sci-fi things at the time as I was doing all this shit.
Which, of course, this is the pinnacle of the VHS sci-fi.
Right. So, like, I had my mind was just saturated in those ideas and that imagery. So when I hit this experience, like, I just literally projected my consciousness into these scenes. And so it culminated in when Connor McLeod is in this hurricane of subtle conscious energy. And he's like, I know everything. I am everything. And in a sense, the mystical principles that I was trying to internalize felt like knowing everything in principle, not knowing every fact or every state of affairs in the world, but knowing the essence of the patterns that define existence. Now, I'm not maintaining that that's true. I'm saying affectively that's what it felt like. And then as the experience receded, I was like, what is this? What is this? And so there was this sort of shadow outline vision of the Buddha. And I had never really studied Buddhism. And it appeared out of like the kaleidoscopic sort of geometric imagery of the thing. And it said samadhi. I didn't even really know what samadhi was. And
Let me just lay this out for you right now.
All right. And I looked it up in the back of, what's that book? The Magician's Companion.
Of course.
Now, I fully submit that I could have read the definition earlier because I had the book that had the definition in the glossary.
Sure.
But it wasn't in the front of my mind. I look it up. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. It is irrelevant to synchronicity because synchronicity exists and occurs only in the consciousness of the individual. So like that, the important moment is there. That other stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah. And just, for context, because in addition to speaking to each other, we're speaking to an audience, theoretically anyway.
Yes.
And the arising and passing away is a sort of elementary altered state that can arise when you spend a lot of time concentrating or just trying to generally point your mind in the direction of something internal or visionary.
Right.
And it can just sort of be triggered accidentally, really, without intent. And people say that what happens with a lot of people when they start messing around with, lucid dreaming or astral travel or anything that involves visualization is they kind of accidentally manage to concentrate well enough to kind of trip themselves into this state, and then after that you're kind of on the ride. Right. Because having put yourself in that, and it can manifest in any number of ways. Ingram has this really crazy graph which shows all the different things that can happen in an arising and passing away experience. And it can involve energy, it can involve like very intense sensations, it can involve very intense ideations.
Often ecstatic.
Yeah, ecstatic is one of the really key things. And it can range from being relatively mild to being really, really far out. I guess this was a little closer to the really, really far out end of things. Mm-hmm. Because,
That's great. That actually, you brought up a memory of mine as well that I haven't thought about in a while, which might have been a sort of A and P, an arising and passing away event, right. Which is arising and passing is a Buddhist term. It comes from specifically a Buddhist ideology, but which I've never been so good at correlating those states in that system. But I had the first incredibly weird spiritual experience I had, which to me sounds very, very reminiscent of what you just described, which still is probably one of the biggest, weirdest spiritual things that's ever happened to me. Was I was doing a meditation that, again, Jason Louv, I think, wrote and designed in a disinformation article. Mm-hmm. Weird. But it was called the Beyond the Wall of Sleep, right? Mm-hmm. Which I appreciate because it's an H.P. Lovecraft reference. Okay. And it was basically a neti-neti thing. So if I remember correctly, you would start and you'd think of two opposites and you'd contemplate them both deeply. Like, what is black? Spend a few minutes doing that. White, a few minutes doing that. Not like thinking too much, not conceptualizing, but contemplating, like trying to go deeply into it beyond thinking, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. And then you'd go, what is both black and white? What is neither black nor white? And then you would do a few of these, and then you would eventually do one, which is, I think, awake, asleep, mm-hmm. and then maybe alive, dead, and then maybe another really pivotal one or something. But I remember doing this once for about an hour when I was still a novice meditator. I was mostly just doing like Zen sitting at the time. Mm-hmm. So I was doing this, and then near the end of it, this fucking crazy state came upon me where I was out of my body. I was in some place where I had no boundaries. Mm-hmm. And it was just like an infinite flood of ecstatic knowledge. Like I felt like I had the answer to every question possible available to me right there at that time. But I was so overjoyed by this that I actually didn't seek to ask any of the questions. Like I didn't need the answers. I was like, this is great. And then at some point I came back in my body and I was like, wow, I really should ask some of those questions because those answers would be quite useful to me now that I'm back in this whole meat space thing. But then I got really into that exercise, and I never again got it to the point where that experience happened. I've had things like that happen in more recent years from doing other stuff, but that was it for several years.
Right. Yeah, people say that a lot. They get some really ecstatic experience, which seems to be deeply revelatory, that they're attached to as being especially meaningful, and they want to go back and recreate that experience, and it just never happens.
Yeah.
I mean, they can do a comparable state of concentration if you're using a framework like that, but not that exact thing.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that kind of like the curse of living in the world that we live in, is that like things are in physical forms for the most part. So when you want a thing, you want a state or an experience, you have to go back to that particular venue. You get attached to the method of getting it, right?
Yeah.
You want the heroin because you want the ecstasy.
Right.
You can't get the ecstasy without the heroin or whatever it is.
Right.
Actually, there's a phrase, I think it comes from the Golden Dawn. It is, which is, by names and images are all powers awakened and reawakened, which is usually used as a magical instruction. You know, this is why we use pictures and words to make magic happen. But I think it's also like, it has a more esoteric meaning, which is about the nature of incarnation, because you are in a realm of things, of appearances, of names and images, and that is where the powers express themselves. You know, like the whole like, this is the universe looking back on itself kind of shit.
Yeah.
You know, it has to go through a physical incarnation for this whole thing to make sense anyway. Right.
I remember, like, talking about this is kind of bringing me back because I don't know what the hell I was thinking, because I got to be so extreme with this stuff. Like, at one point, I was, like, trying to deliberately starve myself in order to put myself into the most extreme altered state that I could, because I had, like, seen a sentence about it, like in Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy or something like that. And I was just eating and drinking as little as possible, and then trying to control dice and things like that. And I would just do these totally whacked out experiments for like insane periods of time. And I look back and I'm like, what in the world possessed me to take this that seriously?
You are bringing me back to a period of my life that I don't think about very often.
Tell me
Yeah,
about
I
it.
did stuff like that too. I mean, I don't know if I have any specific anecdotes at the moment, but it's like, it's because you're hungry and you're living in a place which is starved. And you're trying to, like, I remember there was a quote that really resonated with me once when I was younger that Genesis Peorage said about the place that she grew up, which was some part of England that I can't remember at the moment, but just about how it was like so spiritually barren and destitute that she had to become this incredibly strange person, or strange to her origins, to deal with it or to try to find meaning.
Yeah. I remember when I was a teenager, there was this one time for a 6-month period, or some really long-ass period of time, I was forbidden from all social contact because my mom was totally schizo. She would go on these insane periods where she would get these ideations where that's a whole thing. But she's like, you can't see anyone because your friends are corrupting you.
Right, right. And you're saying, just for context, you're saying schizo is not a euphemism, right?
No, she was seriously
literal.
mentally ill. She was very mentally ill. And she had it backwards. They weren't corrupting me. I was corrupting them. So
close.
During this period of time, like, I barely saw anyone. Sometimes people would sneak by during the day while she was at work, but I was just working, and this is absurd in retrospect, because, well, maybe not, because some people maintain this is a real text, but I was just working the Simon Necronomicon.
Nice.
All, like, every night.
Don't they think that Peter Levenda wrote that?
Well, people
Sorry to
say,
interrupt.
people do say that Levenda wrote it. Levenda maintains that he
did not.
knew the person who did it. that in actuality there was a team of rare book thieves that he had met through he was into a lot of weird shit. Like he and his friends were trying to be like Orthodox priests, and they were on this really weird trip themselves. And he knew a lot of sordid people related to all this weird stuff. And he says that it was some kind of Greek translation of some kind of Proto-Sumerian manuscript, which rendered in English would be the Book of the Dead, i.e. the Necronomicon. And, I could believe that. What's far out about it is that the version that's published in English has prefigurations of some of the names in the Lovecraft mythos. So instead of Azathoth, and coincidentally, the background of today's episode is Azathoth. We put these backgrounds in live, so we have less to do in post. But instead of Azathoth, they have like Azag-Thoth or something.
Weird.
And instead of Yog-Sothoth, it is Yak-Sakak or something.
Wow.
They don't really serve exactly the same purposes or whatever. Yeah, but 6 months I was doing the Simon Necronomicon every day, trying to put myself into these states. It was insane. And then for recreation, every weekend, what I would do is watch The Silence of the Lambs during this period. And it was while this was happening that I first encountered The Matrix. It was on like HBO at 6 a.m.
Wow.
So I stopped the practices and the divination and like the reading, and I put on the TV, and it was like a couple minutes into it, and it was when Neo is asleep at his computer. Wake up, Neo. And at that point, I'd already read Campbell's like Hero with a Thousand Faces, and so as I was watching this movie, I'm like, holy shit. I had resisted watching it for a long time. Everybody I knew was like, you have to watch The Matrix. You have to watch The Matrix. I'm like, no, I'm sure it's stupid.
Yep.
And I was like, fuck. But can you imagine like in that like altered, like extremely bugged out state, like seeing something like that for the first time? So it went really deep into my psyche.
Of course. Wow.
So, as you went on with your practice, like how did it develop? Like what did you move on to focus on, and how did the direction of your work with this stuff sort of shift?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know. I try to be really artistic about it and as creative as possible, and as much kind of challenging myself, like, because I mean, I don't know. I mean, I was a pretty unhappy person for the first half of my life, at least. I was totally socially agoraphobic, super depressed, rather suicidal for certain periods, all kinds of stuff. And so for me, like, I've almost always have used magic mostly for at least what in chaos they call it illuminations, Peter Carroll's word, but just, self-improvement or light work or whatever, fixing myself, because I always perceived there were certain things wrong with me, and which is part of the reason I was unhappy. But so I was always trying to kind of like fix this thing or move this thing or help me to see more clearly or do whatever it was. And it was after years of that I finally got connected with actual organized groups of people doing these things, who I learned more from and got much more deeply into. But I was for a long time like really thirsting for a structure or a curriculum or a teacher or whatever it was, because I wanted to take it as far as I possibly could. And then that just kept happening, and it keeps deepening. Yeah. And, people specialize. There you are.
So, I feel like for me it was like there was the Western ceremonial magic, it was the Levian Satanism, the Thelema, the Seth material, and not necessarily in that order. I'd have to kind of sit down and think about it, but kind of at the same time looking at a broader, like, comparative religious lens. And I feel like there was a period of time during which I put the Western esoteric stuff down for a while.
Yeah.
Because I'd really been focused on philosophy and on trying to engage with metaphysics in a way that you could try to get to the bottom of what's really true about this stuff. Because I've always had a pretty rational, analytical bent, and I feel like when it comes to all this mystical stuff, there's all these layers of symbolism, and there's all these ways that it's filtered through culture, and I wanted to get to the bottom of what's interpretation, what is just the accretion of mythological narrative on top of mystical experience. And I started getting into like hard Western philosophy in an effort to really ascertain, you know, what's really fundamentally true.
Sure.
And I kind of wound up encountering Wilbur, and it was Wilbur who really emphasized, if you really want to do this, you need to pick something and you need to find a teacher. And that's how I got into Buddhism. And that was really a primary focus for a while. And that really helped because it is so methodologically focused. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of, it's susceptible of presentations that are sort of ontologically light. And that was the focus for a while until kind of rediscovering the esoteric magic stuff, kind of reintegrating it.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting to me too because I'm kind of like thank you, keep leaning. In some ways, I'm kind of a history nerd, which is part of the reason why I love the Western esoteric tradition so much, because it's so rich, it's so referential, and every time you're doing a ritual, if you dig deep enough, certain quotes from here, you'll find them somewhere else, and you're like, oh, this is actually from the Chaldean oracles. Wow, lightly paraphrased. Or, oh, this is from, I was reading the Corpus Hermeticum the other day, and there's a ritual I do often. I was like, oh, that line's straight up from the Corpus Hermeticum. The rest of the paragraph isn't. I don't know how that happened or what changes it went through and what channels through the Silk Road of time. But, like, for example, fascinating. I mean, I often think of the Western esoteric tradition in a lot of its rituals. A lot of its rituals are kind of like meditations in motion. Mm-hmm. You know, they're active bodily meditations because, at least in alchemical terms, you have to involve the salt. You can't just do the sulfur and the mercury and do the shit in your mind. You have to use the body. So complete the circuit.
Maybe you could elaborate on that. The sulfur, the mercury, and the salt. What do those represent?
Yes, let me come back to that. So anyway, if you're... in a lot of ways, it seems like it's kind of like the Western tradition is a role play of all of these philosophical ideas and stuff. Mm-hmm. There's so much Platonism, all of these ideas, like the Platonic forms, and then all the Neoplatonists, like you have Proclus and these chains of being relative to the forms, and each thing is kind of like a lighter shade or reflection of the previous, and all of these things are active in theurgy. All of these things are active in, like, say, the Magic of the Golden Dawn, or like any of those groups. I don't really know what Theosophists do. I don't know if they do anything, but sure they do something. But most of these things they're all tied in. And even, for example, you look at the tarot cards. Mm-hmm. The card, the Chariot. Yeah, you can picture it in your head. That image is straight out of a Platonic dialogue. Unfortunately, I can't remember which one right now. I want to say the Phaedro, but it's the charioteer has two horses.
Okay.
He talks about the soul has three parts.
Isn't that in the Republic where they talk about balancing the rational, the appetitive, and the spirited?
Is that in the Republic?
I think it's toward the end of the Republic.
Nice. Yeah.
But I mean, it might come up elsewhere.
The specific metaphor of the charioteer is one that Plato uses while talking about the three parts of the soul.
Right.
And that is clearly what is in that card. Another example, the Wheel of Fortune is straight out of Boethius.
Really?
Boethius, he was in jail. He was a successful statesman until he was imprisoned for some kind of strange money issue with the state, or, a paranoid monarch wanted to do away with him, or whatever it is. Happens all the time. But he was in jail, and then he was visited by Lady Philosophy, and his, the Consolation of Philosophy is the name of his book. it's about what the Lady Philosophy told him, and she gives him this example of the Wheel of Fortune, which is essentially illustrating the, impermanence in Buddhism. It's the same idea. You can't trust circumstances because they're ever changing, and you can't really get around it. You can't gauge your happiness on them because everyone's on the wheel, and the wheel is relentless. She talks about the Wheel of Fortune is not fortuitous at all. In fact, it's totally cruel because you're just going up and then you're going down. There is nothing you can do to stop it. The Wheel of Samsara.
Right. You know what was one of my favorite mystical passages growing up that just kind of gripped me for no particular reason while we're doing this whole like memory lane of mysticism?
Yeah.
It's one of the Ephors from Crowley where he talks about perceiving this wheel, and there is a raven, a wolf, and a lamb.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And the lamb says, I am the chief deceiver. I used to remember this. The Father of all sent forth, whom the Father of all sent forth from before his face in the beginning. And he basically says that the raven is for the lust of the mind, and the wolf is for the lust of the flesh. And the lamb says that it is the chief of deceivers. For my purity and innocence shall seduce the pure and innocent, who but for me should come to the center of the wheel. And them that have rejected me I have given over to the raven and the wolf, and the beak of the one has torn them, and the teeth of the other have devoured the flesh.
That is a troubling and vexing riddle.
Yeah, well, I think it's about superficial spiritual impulses. And
spiritual materialism.
Yeah, and being written by Crowley, I mean, it's sort of about Christ, about like maybe exoteric religion, kind of capturing the spiritual impulse, possibly, because it's the lamb.
Of course.
But also, yeah, I think it does have to do with spiritual materialism because it's pursuing spirituality as an object. Because when it says, but for me should come to the center of the wheel, in a Western mystical context, the center of the wheel sort of represents what in an Eastern context would be off the wheel, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the alchemical glyph of the sun is a circle with a dot in the middle.
Right.
Which is the goal.
And that's also
sun.
The monad.
Yep.
That's also the apeiron. It's a lot of crazy stuff. So now you've got really like a heavy focus on kind of practical alchemy.
Yeah, I'm into it.
Yeah. And you got some interesting perspectives about it, like in terms of how alchemy can serve a role in spiritual liberation.
Yeah,
broadly speaking.
It's basically, alchemy is a science of state changes, right? We have 4 elements. Again, amazing, rich Western tradition comes from Empedocles, as far as we know. Old Greek shit. 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Earth is, in modern science terms, solid matter. Air is gaseous stuff. Water is liquid. Fire, I guess, would be combustion or light, or take your pick. It's not really a state of matter in modern chemistry, but whatever. Same idea.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you're doing laboratory work. You're going back and forth between these states. So physical is the body. What happens when you, evaporate something or melt something? Ice, solid, you melt it, turns into a liquid. Liquid's going to rise. What happens? The spirit leaves the body, right? You're aiming for a more spiritual or volatile state. You're aiming for insight beyond just the physical, beyond the body. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
There's 3 principles in alchemy. There's salt, sulfur, and mercury. Salt is generally referred to as the body. Sulfur is the volatile, which often is referred to as the soul. And mercury is the spirit, which is, it's tough to define, but like the life force, or the greater divinity, right?
Right.
So everything in alchemy, of course, is broken down between the 4 elements and the 3 substances. And if these are what they are concerned with, you can see what this whole science is about. It's about the relationship between body, soul, and spirit. It's about moving between these states and not being simply bound by the physical body.
There's a section I really like in that book that came out recently, Holy Daemon.
Yeah, it's a cool book.
What's the guy's name?
Frater Acher.
Yeah, Acher. And he talks about logos, eros, and thumos. And the thing I really liked in that is he talks about how eros is basically the appetitive and it wants food, sex, stuff like that. And thumos is like the spirited, it wants status, it wants honor, it wants to have a place in the esteem of others. And what he said that I found particularly gripping was that living behind these things is sort of like traveling through a foreign country where you don't know the language. And you have two translators, one of whom only cares about food and sex and stuff like that, and the other of whom only cares about status and cultural standing. And what you will learn in that traveling has a lot more to do with your two translators than it has to do with the country that you're traveling through.
Sure.
And so roughly I think what he says is that logos has to be or nous. I might be getting mixed up how he uses nous and how he uses logos. I think logos has to be illuminated by nous, by this sort of, I guess that's sort of like luminosity in a Western, in a Buddhist context.
Sure, of course. There's a lot of really cool parallels there between, especially like the Neoplatonist stuff and the Buddhist stuff, especially with luminosity, because the most brilliant light of being is listed in Plato as, I guess, the realization of the hyparxis. I might be just kind of riffing here, but yeah, it's like there's a lot of cool similarities and correlations between the two.
Yeah,
that translator metaphor kind of reminds me of the gunas, even in the Vedic stuff. If I remember correctly, it's like Rajas, Pitas, and
Sattvas and Tamas.
Right? Yeah. One of which is more focused on bodily things, one of which is more focused on human things, and one of which is supposed to be more spiritually focused. And of course, people fit into these, have dominances of these things, and that colors the vision that they have of the world. Kind of like the four humors or something. You fit into one of these personality types, and it's the way that the mode with which you're most likely to interact with the world around you.
That Holy Daemon book, I really liked it. I remember in the beginning, he was talking about how, very few people will finish this book, and fewer still will carry out the practices. I'm like, no, I'm totally going to carry out the practices. This is great. I'm totally into it. And they get to the end of it, and he's got this ritual that his higher self has told him to take out of the PGM, the papyri, magick. And it says you have to rub raw egg all over yourself and drink raw egg. I'm like, well, I don't want to get salmonella poisoning. I would totally do this if it didn't involve giving myself salmonella. So thanks for the self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's funny. The reason I didn't do that ritual is because I wasn't able to find a non-toxic edible ink to put on the egg. That was great, though. A really cool reanimation of the PGM. I thought that was really fun.
Because a lot of those texts are really dense in the sense of you don't necessarily have a place to get an obvious foothold.
Yeah. All that really old stuff. Because it's like, to what degree is this totally culturally just abstract and unrelatable to me because I don't have the context? And to what degree is it just very mysterious and esoteric because I don't have the realization?
Yeah. I have a very conflicted relationship with all that stuff. Like, for example, with the Tree of Life. There have been times where, like, the Tree of Life appeared to, and the Tree of Life is this central construct in the Kabbalah, which is a system of Jewish mysticism. And there have been times where it seemed to totally disclose a lot of the deep mysteries about the structure of existence. And there are other times where it just seemed really arbitrary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it also is a reflection of your state of consciousness at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's. I know, like a lot of people that work with the Tree of Life that don't. It's just like a thing they use once in a while, which is weird to me because it's one of those systems in my mind that's you're supposed to just go like full on in with everything you have like forever. So it's on the one sense I'm like, well, it's what are you going to get out of it if you're just dipping your feet in there? But on the other hand, many people do have bizarre and revelatory messages that come out of even cursory use with that or any of these.
I really went there. Like I went to town
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah, you were talking about memorizing 777 while the other kids were memorizing Pokemon stats.
Yeah. And I still have a very conflicted relationship with it. And that came and went over the years. Like, I was talking about that just in the spirit of, like, talking about how we got started and what it's like to be a weird kid who, for whatever reason, becomes obsessed with this stuff. But, you know, one time I was trying to think about it in a more universal sense. And I talked with you about this. And what had originally been my hook with this system is that Kepher, which is the highest point of first manifestation in the tree of life, seems like a cosmological singularity, something from which everything derives. And that was enough of a parallel to really kind of hook my interest, even while I was simultaneously skeptical of it. Because the other thing I was doing while I was first engaging this as a young person, is trying to learn about cosmology and physics and stuff. And I came back to it after not thinking about it for a long time, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. Because, you know, the beginning of the universe, or a gravitational singularity in general, whether or not there was such a singularity at the beginning of the universe, is a place where our knowledge breaks down in the sense that you can't simultaneously apply quantum mechanics and relativity. So that's a lot like Kepler, because, you know, conceptual frameworks and finite consciousness can't attain to this infinite primordial thing. And specifically, what seemed to make sense in this sort of very, very abstract, very sort of zoomed out sort of way, is that you could think of Chokmah as being just energy, and Binah just being mass. And then the next two Sephir would be space and time. And literally, we do know that space and time arise from the interactions of configurations of mass energy. And, you know, Tifereth is a solar thing. And, you know, all the elements of life are manufactured inside of stars.
Yep.
And so you could think about, I forget how this goes, but you think about the life world, and biology is Venus, and mind is being Chokmah. The Yesod is the hard one if you're going to take this kind of naturalistic, more abstract reading. And I'm not sure about that. And then the cap to put on it is that Malkuth is like the collapse of a wave function, and all that coming into like a singular, discrete manifestation.
That's great. I like that a lot.
That kind of brought it back to life for me, looking at it that way.
That's great. Yeah. It's one thing I've kind of found of use with that system too is, you know, they say it, or one of the stories is that it was given by Metatron to man, or like Moses received it. And there's all these, you know, Judaism is really great at mythologizing its stuff. And, you know, there was a time where I was like, that's just really dumb. But the thing I really value about that idea now is, if you really are using that system, really, then you kind of have to look at it like, this is a divine gift. It's not that I can't question it, but that it's right. So I need to realize it's right. And if you just go at it and use it that way, it will reveal how right it is in some of the most illuminating and odd ways that you did not expect. Like, all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, this makes sense. Like, Yesod makes sense in that framework, or whatever it is.
You kind of accept the arbitrariness.
Right. And I don't think it's necessarily like just being, allowing yourself to be intellectually passive, because sometimes it can be very long and very challenging before these connections make sense. Like, if you have a certain kind of mind, at least I know I have the kind of mind that isn't going to let me just be like, okay, it's all good, just let it go, bro. Like, it's like, parts of my mind will keep fighting at it until the thing seems to click.
Sometimes it feels like putting a round peg into a square hole.
Absolutely.
Some of these traditional associations, it's just like, what the living fuck?
Yeah, especially if you're going through 777 or something.
Yeah,
like
especially
very
that.
soon you're going to find something. It's like, are you an elephant? Like, really?
Right, yeah. Or even like without that, because, you know, it was only so long before I gave up on that, because that was, you know,
madness,
ridiculous. It's too much. Like, you have to have a real, like, bizarre fixation on the idea that Aleister Crowley is the second coming or some shit like that in order to get all the way to the end of that, because hell no. But yeah, where was I going with this? Some of these things feel arbitrary.
Yeah, round peg, square hole.
I mean, you can pick up the thought if you want, but
No, I don't know. There are some good parts, I think, in Magic Without Tears. I haven't read it in quite a while, but where he's like kind of giving like cautionary advice, like don't go too crazy with this in this direction. Like just because Kolf is fish, and then fish also shows up in this thing, which is related to the fish hook. Don't be going around saying that the back of the head is the same as a fish, which is blah 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 blah. Like
I tried doing the thing he talked about, where you just do Kabbalistic association all the time.
Yeah.
You know, in book 4, where he talks about it, it's that can bring you to a weird place.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah.
Lon Milo Duquette talked about. I mean, I think it's kind of a simplistic view, but it's still nice. He talked about Kabbalah as just giving your mind so much to work with and so many hoops to jump through that eventually it's just going to pop through the other side, whatever the other side is.
Yeah. I remembered what I was going to say now. The idea that limitations are the precondition for freedom.
Sure.
Because let's say you're playing a game that has rules, like checkers or chess, and then you start not having any rules. And you say, you know, I could just pick up this game and turn the pieces over, I could take your pieces, hide them behind me, throw the board across the room. Then you're not having a meaningful experience anymore. So by imposing a frame, you can allow for the possibility of meaningful permutations and thus like actual freedom. And the other thing that came to mind is Lojong, which is a tradition where it's called mind training, where you kind of like place some assumptions on your interaction with reality. Like, for example, you might assume that all the people you interact with are fully enlightened, omniscient Buddhas who are emanating as shitty, confused, fucked up people in order to teach you about limitations in your own consciousness.
Totally.
And they say that even if that isn't true, the benefit for you remains the same through the spiritual work you do, reacting to them as if that were the case. And Geshe Michael Roach told the story about a bunch of students who were practicing Lojong, and they had a lama who was pretty obviously corrupt and exploiting them. And yet, nevertheless, because of the intensity of the Lojong thing they were doing, they were able to reap really powerful outcomes from that. And I see a kind of parallel between that and what you were saying about what Lon Milo Duquette said.
That's very interesting. I love that analogy. It also reminds me, just when you said the preconditions of change, or what was the statement?
Preconditions of
constrictions required for freedom.
Limitations make you free.
I'm just going to, again, re-reference the quote about by names and images, in this case, definite forms, limitations, wave function collapses.
Okay, yeah.
Are all powers awakened and reawakened?
Conceptual imputation, causes and conditions. So if you take it back to a Buddhist thing, you've got the 3 levels of interdependence: causes and conditions, parts and wholes, conceptual imputation. So name, form, nama, rupa, it's kind of, similar.
Yeah, that's very nice. Yeah, nama, rupa, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it's also, have you ever read that book, Finite and Infinite Games?
No.
It's one of my favorite books. It's really, really great. It's by James P. Carse, who is a Christian theologian.
Wow.
But it starts, and it's, he starts with one very simple idea, which is it's a game theory kind of thing. And he says, so there's 2 kinds of players in a game. There's a finite player and an infinite player. And the rest of the book is just extending off this. But he defines these 2 things as being, a finite player is playing to win. An infinite player is playing to continue playing.
Ooh.
The finite player then is going to want a title into the game. The infinite player doesn't want a title. He wants to play the game. The finite player uses language to silence others. The infinite player uses language to continue dialogue. The finite player, just on and on and on. It's like comparing doing something for itself versus doing something for some kind of gratification or end or currently absent goal or
that's cool.
Means to something else. It's called Finite and Infinite Games.
Oh, wow.
It's bizarre too. He goes all over the place. He's like, "What? How does this apply to gardening? What does this mean for sex? What It's just a really wonderful meditation."
I really enjoy talking to you about this because whereas I started off kind of really focused on the Western thing, I drifted away from it for a long time, and then variously tried to pick it up again at different points. And there's every time I talk to you, or anybody else who's equally invested, or some other people who are equally invested in it, like it really brings to life the current, or the in a Buddhist sense, the lineage of transmission that's alive in that whole thing. So we're coming down to the end of the hour, and maybe
there's a time signature up there.
Yeah, indeed. So maybe we could come around to some concluding thoughts, and we'll be back again to continue this conversation in the next episode.
Wow. How do you conclude something?
I don't know, because it's been kind of an experiential discussion.
Yeah.
Mysticism. What does mysticism mean to you now? Go and think, considering that we're like kind of starting off anecdotally, kind of autobiographically about this kind of falling ass backwards into mysticism. What would you say that it means to you today?
Good God. I don't know, becoming more than human, knowing God, deifying the self, maybe losing the self.
Yeah, maybe all those things kind of being the same thing.
Yeah, different takes or different perspectives on one thing, you know?
Yeah, I like that, because personally I think like the apotheosis of the self is, the precondition of that is recognizing that the self doesn't exist intrinsically. And that's sort of like the self becoming transparent in the Christian mystical language, or the creature getting out so that God can get in.
Yeah, little self, big self.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
suck on that.
Yeah, so we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and record the next episode, where we'll continue this line of thought. And so I am Nathaniel Voss.
Oh, my name is Seth.
That's right. And you were watching Ontological Shock.